Welcome to Fulcrum Democracy Forum. I'm Ugo Balta, Executive Editor with the Fulcrum, a daily cross-partisan news publication that engages citizens in evolving government to better meet the needs of all people. To that end, we strive to share many perspectives to widen our readers' viewpoints. For this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Ulcca Joshi Hansen, a sociocultural futurist and author of the award-winning book, The Future of Smart. Dr. Hansen's research and writing examine the underlying values and assumptions that shape modern-day systems and explores how we can bridge cultural and ideological divides during periods of rapid social change and technological advancement. She and I became acquainted through the Op-Ed Project, and Moderate Voices Are Vanishing. Here's How to Get Them Back, published on the Fulcrum. Dr. Hansen, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Let's begin the conversation by learning more about the work that you lead. You're an internationally recognized expert and thought leader on human-centered design, working with individuals, organizations, and institutions to shift mindsets and design systems that enable individuals and communities to rebuild human connection and social cohesion. Tell us more about that work.
So I'll start with what a futurist is, since most people don't know. So, we work across disciplines, and what we do is we look at trends so that we can peer over the horizon and get a sense of what might be coming so that we can think about the choices that we're making in the present in ways that hopefully set us better up for the future. So when I started my career about 25 years ago, and I used this term human-centered, people would look at me, right, because it felt redundant, because what else were systems or education systems or schools except human-centered? And of course, in 2023, we had ChatGPT and these other popular models of AI that were released. And I remember reading someone said that it was the year that we looked AI in the face. And we had to ask ourselves what it means to be human. And so this question of what it is to be human, especially in an age of AI, feels really central. And you talked about my academic background, which included philosophy and neuroscience, human development, law and policy, systems change. And what I do and what I invite people to do is to think about the unstated values and assumptions that undergird our lives. And I invite us all to think about how we examine and shift those because, and I'm happy to chat about this more, many of them aren't designed to support the complexity and the richness of what it is to be human. They sort of flatten us. And so we need to examine them so that we can build systems that actually work for us rather than kind of stifle the diversity of being human.
Yeah, I think you're right. So too often it becomes one-dimensional, and I think it's very important to kind of take a look of the different layers that we all have as individuals, and how that is often an asset in regardless of personal relationships or at the workplace. We're living in an age where sometimes that dimension of diversity is being weaponized, especially politically, in regards to DEI, and that being a negative towards fulfilling a lot of accomplishments as individuals, as organizations, and as a society. Can you talk a little bit about that in regards to just how the winds led by politics is changing that dynamic, and what we can do as individuals to take a step forward in a positive way?
Gosh, that's such a big question, Hugo. And so I'm going to ask for your forgiveness as I zoom out just a little bit, right? Because I think you went straight into the everyday and what we're doing. But if we shift back, right, there are two big ways that we can think about understanding ourselves as human beings. And it's important that we be able to hold both of those at the same time. So for a really long time, most human societies were more similar than different. And human beings, we used to live in communities, and we saw ourselves as connected with other people and the earth and the seasons, right? So we understood ourselves to be these kind of whole embodied people that lived in context. And you can think of that way of understanding the world as holistic or indigenous. And when I say indigenous, I don't mean specific people, right? Like Native Americans or Maori or the San. I mean how we used to live before external systems changed how we used to live and understand ourselves. And in Europe about 500 years ago, there was this shift in the way that human beings understood ourselves. And this metaphor of the world as a machine became really ascendant. And the world as a machine is interesting because you can take a machine apart and look at the pieces and try and understand how they work and put the thing back together again and manipulate it. So it makes it easy for us to use the world, right? And there's something very important about that. We have a lot of scientific discoveries that came, but it also encourages us to kind of pull the world apart and understand ourselves as these kind of fragmented, decontextualized people. So that I think of identity, for example, I'm a woman, or I'm Indian American, or I'm a philosopher, as opposed to I'm a human being and I have all of these facets of my identity and who I am in this integrated way. And so we need to go back, I think, to being able to see the world and hold the world in a level of complexity. And I think one of the things we're seeing in our politics right now, and it's certainly speeded up and enabled by things like social media and how the media kind of steals our attention, right? It's an environment in which we're encouraged to say simple things, to say sound bites, to kind of simplify everything, as opposed to holding the complexity of it, which requires a little bit more time, a little bit more nuance, a little bit more of our whole selves to kind of understand and allow other people to bring that wholeness to the table as well.
And thank you for that. I appreciate you taking a step back and giving us a larger view, a balcony view, in regards to self-identification and community. One of the things that you mentioned was AI and technology. And as I was listening to you answer the question, is technology chipping away at our humanity? As a communicator, I marvel at technology and am old enough to remember when the internet was maturing, and marveled at being able to communicate with someone not only across the street, across the state, across the country, but across the globe. And social media has certainly played. It gets a ding for a lot of the negative misinformation, as it should, but it's also played such a large role in connecting us and really truly realizing us as a global society. How does one navigate technology, which absolutely has a laundry list of positives, as much if not more negatives, and AI being just the latest and maybe even putting us on a fast track like never before when it comes to technology? How does one navigate through that and retain their humanity?
Well, I think that's the $64,000 question, to go back to a TV show that you and I may have grown up with. But I think you've hit it on the head, right? Whenever you talk to me, you're not likely to get an either or answer. You're probably likely to get a both and with. So technology is a tool. It is true that I think AI, generative AI, the tools that we're seeing right now are advancing faster than many of the technologies that we've seen emerge over the last 3 industrial kind of revolutions. But it is a tool. But one thing about artificial intelligence, that term itself is problematic, because when we think of intelligence, we think of human beings. But the reality is AI is non-biological intelligence. It's intelligence that's built on this substrate. And what distinguishes us as human beings is that we are living, embodied biological beings that live in place and time and space in relationship to other people. And I think AI is never going to be able to replicate that, or at least not in any foreseeable future, right? It's never going to be able to replicate that. So I think one of the things we have to do is think about what's our comparative advantage as human beings. What are the ways in which we think? What are the ways in which we cogitate, right, that are unique? And I think there's some really interesting work being done on this theory of the extended mind, right? That we don't just think with our brains, which is what AI is replicating really well, is our brain-based thinking, but we also think with and in our bodies. We think with other people, and we think inside of our environments. And I think being human in this age is really about leaning into those other ways of being and creating, seeing and navigating in the world.
Thank you. That is absolutely a wonderful perspective of the multidimensionalness of our humanity and what technology can right now can only tap into. I mentioned that I mentioned the op-ed project,
Hmm.
and I mentioned moderate voices are vanishing. Here's how to get them back. A thought-provoking piece that you wrote and we published at the Fulcrum. Tell us more about your article.
So, the article was written at a pretty personal moment for me. I've been involved in politics since I was in college. Worked in community organizing and elections in New Jersey and in Newark, where I grew up and taught. But my husband has been involved in policy and in elected. As an elected official in Colorado for the last 10 years. And as a result, our whole family has been, including our two sons. And he just left the legislature. And there were a number of reasons. But I think over the last 3, 4, 5 years, it was becoming more and more of a drain on our family as we saw this man who we know, right, in his complexity and his nuance, as a man from the Midwest who lived in South Africa, who has a family that spans kind of countries and ideologies and faith environments, right, being simplified in our current political moment to this white man who used to work in corporate America, and therefore, right, there's a whole litany of things that I talk about in the article. And I feel like what we saw over the last 10 years was the leaving it was the departure of a lot of folks that we knew who were more moderate, more pragmatic, more willing to sit in the middle of complex questions of policy, that those folks were either pushed out through primary elections or chose to leave because they were being sort of attacked on both sides for not being pure enough, right? And I think that made staying in the legislature for him this kind of exercise in, I guess, being more exhausted and more unhappy than happy about what he could actually do. And so for me, that was really personal. And I wrote the piece because our son wrote an op-ed piece in which he kind of said something that broke my heart. He said, I've been part of this and I was so excited. And then in the last couple of years, the way my dad was treated, the way people are talking about politician and politics made me feel like I don't want to do this after all. And to me, that's a real danger sign for our democracy when you have young people, when you have moderates saying, I can't thrive and stay in this environment. And I think this is a moment for us all to really reflect on what that means for us, both as a society, but also individually.
Yeah, you sharing your lived experiences in the article that you wrote really struck home to me. I'm also a parent. I have children that are 18 and 21 years old, and we have long conversations about their experiences and my experience and our experiences. And of course, as you've mentioned, of late, everything is weaponized, driven by political agendas, and it just seems like the polarization, the gap continues to widen, and there's just very little room for conversations that not necessarily that meet in the middle, in the sense that we're listening to each other. I'm not looking necessarily to change your mind, but I'm looking to understand you as a human being. And then by understanding you at that level, we can have healthy discussions and debates about the paths to achieving what is more often than not has been my experience, mutual goals. But right now it just seems like more and more when we're looking at government, we're looking at politics, there's more of a focus on doubling down on your particular side, whether it's the right or the left, and then using communication and marketing to speak to that, perhaps base, but maybe a small portion of that base.
Yeah, that's true. And if I can again sort of put on this futurist hat for a minute, right, and offer a slightly different perspective on some of what we're seeing. So, I started talking about these two kind of worldviews and the ways in which we understand the world. And it's interesting because in neuroscience, it seems that these two ways of understanding the world are actually built into the structure of our brains. And I find it helpful for myself, at least, to think and talk about it this way. But human beings have to do two things at the same time. We live as embodied beings in this really complex world, and I want to be clear, this is not about the old idea that if you're you're right-brained, you're creative, you're left-brained, you're analytic. It's not that. But the two hemispheres of the brain, it appears, pay attention to the world in different ways. And the right hemisphere is kind of this big end of a funnel that allows us to take in and sit with the complexity and the richness of the world that we live in and our experiences. And the left hemisphere takes all of that complexity and it makes it simpler through this very linear, abstractive, reductive process. And when the brain is working properly, things start in the right, they go to the left, and they should be sent back to the right to be used in context. And the folks who do this work in the neuroscience field are saying, and I think they're right, that we're living in a world right now that is very left hemispheric dominant. So that we do try and simplify everything. And we say you're good or bad. This is, right or wrong, as opposed to understanding that when we live in a complex world, when we're thinking about things like policy, whether it's environmental policy or economic policy or healthcare policy, there are lots of competing valid values. And that part of the work of policymaking, especially, is to reconcile those competing values. And that requires us to sit in that complex middle space, right? And that requires right hemispheric muscles, which are very different than the muscles that our dominant culture right now invites us to sort of exercise and to build. And so I think as we're thinking about rebuilding our democracy, as we're each thinking about being citizens, it's helpful for me at least to think about how do I build this kind of right hemispheric capacity to say, this is what I believe, and this is how my lived experience and my experiences have shaped my beliefs. And I can sit with someone else who maybe has had a different set of lived experiences that lead them to different conclusions, and don't have to dehumanize them, don't have to make them wrong, but that we can sit together as people and then say, okay, what is our shared goal, right? About creating healthcare systems that work for people, or to think about things that help us live on a planet that will actually sustain human life. And how can we find some common ground in that? And that's what I think we're starting to miss. And part of that, as you said, and as I think I alluded to, is because a lot of our systems, whether it's the media environment or just our broader culture, which is highly individualistic, right? Highly kind of fragmented as opposed to thinking about things in holistic ways, encourages us to kind of think of things in this either or, good, bad, left, right kind of thing, for lack of a better word, on the political spectrum.
Again, really rich thoughts about the times that we're living in and how to address some of those issues. One of the things that you've mentioned that I want to ask you before we let you go, so a lot of who we are is shaped by our lived experiences. I am very much the son of Hugo and Graciela Balta, immigrants to the United States from Peru. You're a first-generation American who began school as an English language learner and was the first in your family to complete college. Your career began as a public school educator, and you went on to earn a doctorate from Oxford University focused on philosophy, neuroscience, and human development, as well as a law degree from Harvard Law School. Tell us more about your background, your upbringing, and who and what inspires your work.
So for the purposes of this, I'll say that one of my identifying features more recently is this idea of being a third culture kid. So a third culture kid is somebody whose parents grow up in one environment, you grow up in a second environment, and at some point in your life, you're sort of living in a third. And so my family is Indian by background, but Tanzanian by 3 generations, and my parents immigrated to the US in 75. And I was born here, but I was raised by family in Arusha, and came back and began school as an English language learner. But by the end of grad school, right, my mid to late 20s, I had lived or studied or worked in Tanzania, Botswana, France, Russia, Germany, India, the UK, Dubai, right? So I have all of these experiences. And the research around third culture kids, right, our strength is that we're really good at moving across contexts and cultures because that's what we do from the time we're really young. But it can be hard for us to feel like we belong anywhere because our identities are being formed at this time when we're not rooted anywhere. But I think for me, I see this third culture kidness as more of a superpower in the world that we're living in today, because I think what it's taught me is that, I think in the US, we're very good at thinking that we're the most racist, horrible, misogynistic, unequal place on the planet. And when you live in different places, you realize that actually there are these bigger trends of how human beings are and how we shape ourselves, both in good ways and in maybe not so good ways. And you can kind of, at least for me, it feels like I get to step back and think about how do we understand who we currently are, why we might be that way, and what it means for us to more consciously make choices, right? And that's where I come back to this right hemispheric capability of pausing, of taking 3 or 4 deep breaths, and being conscious that we get to make choices in our sphere of control about what we do, and that that is going to change what's possible, right, out beyond us in our spheres of influence and the things that we care about at a macro level. So I think that third culture kid perspective and the ability to sit maybe more easily in that non-duality is something that really impacts and drives me. And I'm actually working on a second book that is about third culture kids and why these capacities that we develop feel so relevant in a country like the US, where I think all of us are third culture kids, right? All of us are navigating complex, interesting, rich identities, but we've never really thought about it that way. But I think there are 2 quotes, I'll just end with this, that drive me. The first is, if there's no transformation inside of us, all the structural change in the world will have no impact on our institutions. And I think it's very easy to think about policy and institutions, but those are made of people. And if we don't change how we show up in the world and with other people, it feels like that structural change is ultimately going to lead us back to some version of now. And then this other idea for me is this sphere of control, influence, and concern. And sometimes, it can feel very overwhelming to say, how do we develop a world in which everyone has an economic system that works for them or a climate that's sustainable? But my sphere of control is what I do and how I respond when things happen, right? And if I can be really thoughtful about those 2 things, then I think it shapes everything else. It's like the butterfly wing effect. And so those 2 things really kind of inform my work, both personally and professionally.
I look forward to reading that book, and I hope you get inspired to write a column on that, because I think it's absolutely very useful to better understand the situations that many of us find ourselves, and like you said, leverage that superpower. Dr. Ulcca Joshi Hansen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This was a wonderful conversation.
And thank you all for spending this time with us as well. Conversation and collaboration nurture a well-informed citizenry. Amugo Alta.